Hey guys, some exciting news for you just before we get into our episode today. I was able to sit down and record our second interview episode we will release here on Sandy Creek Stirrings. Last time it was Dr. Scott Cottle. This time it is the most influential man that has ever come into my life, and I say that with no shame, no guile, and an absolute seriousness. That is the man that has had the biggest impact upon my life, and that would be Pastor Patrick Jimenez, my father. And so it was an absolute honor to have him on. And so we talked about many things in that episode, from child rearing to marriage tips to what's it like being an overseas missionary, the biggest takeaway from being a pastor, the testimony of how a Catholic who had been to the Vatican came to the Lord. And so a great interview episode. You're going to want to listen to it, and it'll be released on November 20th, Friday, November 20th. Don't forget that interview with Pastor Patrick Jimenez. But for now, here's today's episode.
And if you're going to win souls, you've got to love souls. In spite of their meanness, in spite of the way they look, in spite of everything, you've got to seek to bring souls to Jesus Christ because you love them, because Jesus loved them, and because Jesus died for them, and you're trying to bring them to the Son of God.
Welcome to the Sandy Creek Stirrings podcast. Thank you for listening today. If this is the very first episode you have ever listened to, then I want to thank you for joining me here today and for giving Sandy Creek Stirrings a try. But if you are a faithful listener and you've listened to all the episodes, I want to thank you today in this episode for being a faithful listener. We could not do what we do here at Sandy Creek Stirrings without you. We need listeners, of course, and so thank you for being a faithful listener. And I wanted to start off today's episode by thanking you so much for listening to Sandy Creek Stirrings. Let me encourage you. If Sandy Creek Stirrings has been something that you have enjoyed, that you've gotten some content out of, let me encourage you to hit that subscribe or that follow button on whatever platform you listen to Sandy Creek Stirrings on. And we are on a bunch of different platforms. We're on Apple Podcast, we're on Google Podcast, we're on Spotify, we're on Breaker, we're on Stitcher, we're on Radio Public, we're on Overcast, we are on a lot of them. And so let me encourage you, you can always hit the subscribe or the follow button on that channel. You can also leave a review. And let me encourage you to do that. You can leave a review on, I think, the only platform that actually right now allows reviews, at least in the top platforms, is Apple Podcast. And so let me encourage you, if it's something that you're enjoying, something that you're getting content out of, then let me encourage you to go and you can leave a review there on Apple Podcast. Or if you're one of the listeners through our website, some of you may not know this, but you can listen to Sandy Creek Stirrings through our website. And really, it goes through the podcast host that I use, Anchor. And you can also go to Anchor and listen to it, but you can listen to our podcast episodes on the website. And so if obviously on the website you don't have a place to leave a review, but if you're a Facebook follower, you can go and you can leave us a review on Facebook. You can share the episodes through social media and accomplish that and do that. And I would appreciate it from Sandy Creek Stirrings. And so thank you so much. But thank you for listening most of all. And so I sure do appreciate you coming and listening faithfully and staying tuned to the episodes that we release. I really pray and I really hope that it has been something that has been useful to you, that has been helpful. And so today is Thursday. It's another Baptist history lesson, another Baptist history episode, and I hope that you have enjoyed the Baptist history series, and it's something that really, really changed me, really changed my life, really changed what I knew about myself, about my Christianity, about my denomination. And you've heard me say many times, I don't like using the term denomination so much. I understand what it means. I know what it's talking about. So every now and then I will use the term denomination, but it's just not something I'm a huge fan of, because here's the deal. There aren't a whole bunch of denominations. There's really only one religion, if you want to use the term religion. And it's based on that relationship with Jesus Christ, and really it's the Baptist. And I understand there are other quote-unquote denominations such as Catholicism and Presbyterians and Methodists and you name it, even non-denominationals is a denomination. And so I understand that. I understand what it means. But when I came and I began studying Baptist history out, it changed me. It truly changed me. It impacted my life in such a way I never knew that it could. And when I was first posed that question by one of my fellow college students at Golden State Baptist College in the fall semester of 2014, I was posed that question, are Baptists Protestants? And I couldn't answer it. Here I am. I grew up in a church staff home. My dad was always on church staff from the time I can remember as a young child all the way up till now. My dad's a pastor. And so I grew up as a child of a church staff home. I grew up as a child in a missionary home. I grew up in a somewhat pastor home. So I grew up, I felt like I should have known the answers, but I didn't. And there's something to tell you right there. I don't have all the answers. Listen to me, I still don't have all the answers. You say, but you talk about some stuff that I don't know about. The only difference is I've studied it out. And there will be some of you, you'll ask me a question, I won't know the answer. I don't know the answer to every question. Just today, somebody asked me a Bible question. I had no idea. No idea what the answer was. And so I had to look it up. I had to do a little study, and I came to the answer. You too can find out the answers. You could host your own podcast if you just spent time studying. If you study and learn to know the author of the Word of God, then you'll learn a lot about the Word of God. And so when they asked me, are Baptist Protestants, I didn't know the answer. Have you ever been there before where you don't know the answer? Where you don't know? Yeah, so I was there. I didn't know. Our Baptist Protestants, I wasn't able to answer it. And so I began my journey, my study of Baptist history, and boy, has it made such a difference in my life. I can tell you, I live different now than I used to, and Baptist history had an effect on me because of that. Because of that study, Baptist history had an effect on me. And so we have gotten into, just last week, we have gotten into my favorite part of Baptist history, and that's Baptist in the New World. And last week we did Baptist in the New World Part 1. This week we're talking about Baptist in the New World Part 2. For reference sake, if you missed it, if you missed last week, you're really going to want to go back and listen to last week when we began the story of freedom of religion in the New World. Did they have freedom of religion? No. They honestly did not. They did not have freedom of religion. Okay, it wasn't there. That's what the claim is. That's what's often taught. Hey, as a kid, I was taught they arrived in the New World and it was freedom of religion for all, but that's not true. They set up government religions, government-run religions that you were forced to adhere to. That's shocking to me when I found that out, and maybe shocking to you. But as we began to study some of these things out, we came into the story and talked about Roger Williams. And so for reference sake, if you missed last week, go back and listen to that week, just last week, and it'll get you caught up. Last week we left off, and I'm not going to take any further time to review because we're cutting into time for today. But last week we left off with Roger Williams. He had been banished from New England for his religious beliefs. That's right, banished. You heard me right. Banished for his religious beliefs. In a letter, he said this concerning the winter of New England and his banishment time. He said, quote, "It's a miserable, cold, howling wilderness." And we said last week that without shelter, he'd be done for. Without food, he'd be done for. Without the necessities of life, Williams would be done for in the winter in New England. But something, if you remember last week, something God had put on Williams' heart was coming to sight that would aid him and literally allow him to survive. You say, what was that? What was that literally allowed Roger Williams to survive? Well, you've been waiting a week, so let me go ahead and give you the answer to what he was waiting on. While in Providence, Williams was known to visit the Indian villages. He sat in their wigwams. He learned their language so he could share the gospel with them. He stood up for them in the town. He did good to them. And when he reached out into the New England wilderness and began to travel, when he reached their camps, he was weak. And they had pity on him, remembering that this was that kind fellow that stood up for us. And he welcomed them in. If you remember, Roger Williams stood against the law of patents. Of course, the law of patents was a law passed by the king that any lands discovered by the explorers of said king could claim the land as their own. Williams said, no. The natives own the land, and they ought to be fairly compensated for it. The natives own the land. They ought to be fairly compensated for it. And so he stood up for the rights of the Indians, the Native Americans. He stood up for the rights, and they appreciated that. And so they took him in. They literally rescued him from the howling wilderness and kept him alive. So shortly after that, Roger Williams bought a tract of land from the Indians, and there he began to build a colony where they would have complete and utter religious liberty. That was his goal. And this would be the foundation of Providence Plantation. Providence Plantation, and it would eventually combine with another great Baptist, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but it would eventually form or combine with Newport to form Rhode Island. So here Roger Williams in Providence Plantation, he began the foundation for religious liberty. A foundation for religious liberty. That's what he wanted. That's what he wanted. We're about to talk about a man named John Clarke in just a few minutes, but it's a foundation that John Clarke would come, and he would truly make firm and strong. This basic foundation Roger Williams built, John Clarke would really make it stronger. In fact, a New York newspaper in the 1800s said this concerning Roger Williams and his belief on religious liberty, that all men should be able to choose who they will serve. By the way, that's what God says. Joshua 24, we've said it many times, choose you this day whom ye will serve. Religious liberty. It's a true Baptist distinctive, a Baptist doctrine that every man is created with a free will to choose or to not choose to serve God. And so that New York newspaper in the 1800s, they said this concerning Roger Williams' belief on religious liberty. They said, quote, Baptists have solved a great problem. They combine the most resolute conviction, the most stubborn belief in their own special doctrines with the most admirable tolerance of the faith of other Christians. Many Baptists and other persecuted people began to travel here, and within 3 years of Providence Plantations, 30 families were there at the colonies. 30 families. Williams, in fact, saved the colonies, Plymouth, saved Boston, on 2 separate occasions from the war with the Indians because of his relationship with the Indians. He saved them twice. This was literally a miracle on earth for their time. But that's what Roger Williams did. Let me ask you a question. Would you save colonies that had literally banished you to death, basically? Would you save them from impending doom? Roger Williams did. Roger Williams did. So there in Providence Plantation, which would eventually become the state of Rhode Island, he began the true foundation in America for religious liberty. He wrote the Providence Compact of August 1638. It says this, quote, We whose names are underwritten, being desirous to inhabit the town of Providence, do promise to submit ourselves in active and passive obedience to all such orders or agreements as shall be made for public good of the body in an orderly way, by the major consent of the present inhabitants, matters of families, incorporated together into a township, and such others whom they shall admit unto the same, only in civil things. You see, every other law within the colonies during this time was based not only on civil things, but religious things as well. They said, no, we're not going to judge you on religious basis. We're going to judge you on a civil basis, thus keeping religious freedom alive and well. And so eventually they would form a church, a Baptist church in Providence in 1638. But the reality is, the establishment of the true First Baptist Church in the New World was not Roger Williams' church in Providence Plantations. There was another man who would plant the first Baptist church in America, and he arrived in America after Roger Williams was already there. He's the man I just mentioned a few minutes ago. His name was John Clarke. John Clarke. Let's talk about him today. John Clarke was born in Suffolk, England in 1609. He was incredibly important to the cause of the Baptist in America. As Roger Williams, even not if more so. I truly believe more so. He was truly the man who really accomplished religious liberty and laid the framework for Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, men like that, to base the Declaration of Independence on and other such laws. He was educated as a physician, practiced, in fact, as one for quite some time. But not only that, he was equally educated in law and theology, as he was in medicine. I mean, he was a scholar of his day. But he thought his fortune would be better in the New World, and so he set sail and he arrived in Boston in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in November of 1637. November of 1637. But let me tell you this. He didn't arrive without the area being much confusion, being in a lot of distress, and true chaos. It was upon arrival John Clarke stepped off the boat. He learned that a Baptist by the name of Roger Williams had just been banished from the colonies. So we're stepping back a few years back to when Roger Williams had just been banished. John Clarke's personal separatist, he was a separatist by religious conviction. John Clarke's personal separatist tendencies, they stirred in his heart. When he heard of this, though, he was unsure where did he really stand on the issue. While he was considering these thoughts, a controversy arose up around a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. I want you to remember that name, Anne Hutchinson. She was standing up for Roger Williams. In fact, she was holding home Bible studies for ladies. She and her family, they were greatly affected by the stand of Roger Williams, his preaching and the things that he said. They wanted to make sure that they stood for their faith as well. Now, there is nothing in history that gives her an air of preference, but she was simply what the court would use to make an example. She was accused, by the way, of having a masculine, quote, having a masculine spirit, denying the resurrection and threatening subversion to the government, which were not true. She and her family came under heavy fire, and everything was coming to a climax very quickly. It was through this testimony that we find John Clarke came to a true saving knowledge of Christ during this time period. And he also realized that for safety reasons, it would probably be best for him and this group of Baptist families, including the Hutchinsons, should probably leave. And so, as Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, John Clarke assumed the reins of leadership and led the small flock of Baptists, really 18 families, not so small, out of Boston. As they left, as they literally walked across the border, an order of banishment was passed on them with a reminder, don't you ever return. They went to New Hampshire for the winter of 1637. It was there that they officially, this 18-family group, they officially assembled as a Baptist church, a traveling one as that, and John Clarke was selected as their pastor and leader. From there, they were unsure where to go, what to do. They were unfamiliar with the land, so they decided to travel to, well, who else but to Roger Williams. So they traveled to Providence Plantations. He, in turn, told them of a beautiful island and encouraged them to go to the southern part of the island and settle there. They did. They settled what was known as, and sometimes known today as, Newport, Rhode Island, still known that today. It was there that they fashioned the first government document protecting religious opinions within that island, and really an even greater document than the Portsmouth Compact, or the Providence Compact, of Roger Williams. They wrote the Portsmouth Compact, and it says this, quote, "We whose names are underwritten do here solemnly, in the presence of Jehovah, incorporate ourselves into a body politic, and as he shall help, will submit our persons, lives, and estates unto our Lord Jesus Christ, the King of kings and Lord of lords, and all those and most absolute laws of his, given us by his holy word of truth, be guided and judged thereby." And you'll find they would go on to write even greater documents concerning religious liberty. And so, in a map on your head, I want you to imagine the New England area. Imagine the New England area in your mind. And I want you to go and imagine Boston, where Boston is. Maybe you need to go look at a map. Look at Boston, look at Plymouth, and go down to Rhode Island. You can see Providence. You can see Newport and where they're at on the map. And so in our narrative today, We're going to leave Roger Williams in Providence, and we're going to leave John Clarke in Newport, both having their Baptist churches. And I want you to travel back with me to the colonies. Let's see what's going on in the colonies during this time, while Roger Williams and John Clarke are making great strides for religious liberty on their ends in Rhode Island. With John Clarke and Roger Williams out, including the Hutchinson family, out of the colonies, the court of Massachusetts did something very quickly to try and keep this same incident from happening again. Something that might even sound familiar to you, in fact. Let me ask you this. Why did the Boston Tea Party happen? Now, as I said, this isn't an American history class. This is a Baptist history lesson, Baptist history series, and so we're going to talk and keep it to Baptist history. But within American history, why did the Boston Tea Party happen? I'll give you a second to think about it. Why did it happen? I'll tell you why. Because of, have you heard this phrase before? Taxation without representation. Does that sound familiar? The colonists were not represented in British Parliament, but they were being taxed heavily for things that they couldn't even stand up and debate over. It wasn't right. It sparked the war for independence, but that wasn't the first instance, okay? That was not the first instance of taxation without representation. Here's what you'll find when you study Baptist history, true history at that. The first instance you will find in the New World of taxation without representation is right here in Massachusetts in 1638, when they passed a compulsory tax required of all citizens to support the state-run government. A tax that if you lived within Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Boston, if you lived there, you were required to pay. You say, how's that taxation without representation? Because the general population, they had no vote in political government. They had no vote in electing its officials. It was true. Taxation without representation. You were taxed to finance the government's church, and you couldn't disagree with that. Taxation without representation. And by the way, this won't be the only instance you'll see of this in history. And so I want to take you to a man in Boston by the name of Thomas Painter. Thomas Painter. He began to read the Bible for himself, which I've said many times is the most dangerous thing somebody of another denomination can do, is to literally sit down and read the Bible for themselves, throw away the doctrine, throw away the traditions of men, and read the Bible for themselves. It's the most dangerous thing somebody of another denomination can do because they won't stay that denomination very long. Thomas Painter, he began to do that. He began to examine the cry of the Baptist when it really came down to the crux of the argument, rebaptism versus infant baptism. So he began to study it. It was through this study of the Bible we find Thomas Painter accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior. In 1644, it came time for the newest Painter baby to be baptized as an infant. In Thomas Painter's mind, he weighed the consequences. Should I have my infant baptized and follow man, or should I refuse and follow God? He chose not to have his baby baptized. He was arrested. He was dragged before the court of deputies. He refused. He refused to consent to their baptism. He said, quote, "It is an anti-Christian ordinance." For this, he was sentenced to 20 lashes. You say, in the New World, I thought there was religious freedom. I thought you could serve whatever God you wanted to. I thought... No. I'm afraid, friend, you've been uninformed. I'm afraid, friend, that you have not heard the truth of what was going on to the Baptists in the New World during this time. Sentenced to 20 lashes, all because he wouldn't follow their religious laws. Religious laws. Watching from his tower, watching the beating of Thomas Painter, Governor Winthrop wrote this. He said, quote, Anabaptism increased and spread in the country, which occasioned the magistrates at the last court to draw an order for banishing such as continued obstinate after due conviction. You say, what was that law? Well, it was reinforced on November 13th, 1644, quote, "For as much as experience has plentifully and often proved that since the first arising of the Anabaptists about 100 years since, they have been the incendiaries of commonwealths and infectors of persons in main matters of religion and troublers of churches in all places where they have been. It is ordered and agreed that if any person or persons within this jurisdiction shall either openly condemn or oppose the baptizing of infants or authority to punish the outward breaches of the first table shall be sentenced to banishment." Sentenced to banishment. These were the laws they were passing to try and stop you from having true religious freedom. Well, Roger Williams, he's in the colony of Providence. You also had the colony of John Clarke in Newport. You had another colony of Portsmouth, right near Newport. They began to fear that maybe Massachusetts would try and stretch out their legislative powers north to their island. And so Roger Williams decided, let's stop that from happening. He set sail for England in 1644. Set sail to try and secure a contract from Parliament to govern themselves independent of the other colonies, to be able to govern themselves. In England, he arrived to Parliament uprising. Terrible things were happening. He arrived to chaos. It would seem like hope was lost. Have you ever been there before? Have you ever been there where you wanted to do something, you felt like this was the way you needed to go, and when you got into it, it was just utter chaos? It wasn't how you thought it would go. He arrived to Parliament uprising, Parliament overthrow. And so after contacting a former friend with influence and much prayer on March 4th, 1644, God did lead, and God did provide, as he always had, and he always will. Williams received a charter for the incorporation of Providence plantations from a very distracted Parliament, and received that incorporation. And what a blessing that was. God provided. They were able to receive and secure the fact that they were able to govern themselves. Massachusetts, the Bay Colony, could not reach out and try and grasp them and enforce their religious laws upon them. They could rule and reign over themselves and have true religious freedom. This was an exciting time. During his time in England, though, waiting for the charter to be completed, Williams published a document. He entitled it, "The Bloody Tenet of Persecution." The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. It was to give awareness to the Baptist cause in the New World, and it contained within it the case for religious freedom. The case for religious freedom. John Cotton, he was a government minister in Boston. He was furious, absolutely furious at its publishing, and he sent a document of his own to be printed in England. He called it "The Bloody Tenet Washed and Made White in the Blood of the Lamb," countering, combating, pushing aside everything that Williams said within the bloody tenet of persecution. Incredible. Incredible. Williams, not to be outdone, responded with a document entitled "The Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody." Now, while this may seem insignificant, this did much, this did a lot to raise awareness in regards to true religious freedoms. People began to read Williams' writings as contraband and began to stir in their hearts. They saw the evidence of Williams' writings and also viewed really the weak response of John Cotton. Let me tell you something. God always has a plan. God always has a plan. God's always working. Well, the colonies, they were still working under the fingers of Satan. Working under the very fingers of Satan. On September 9th, 1646, they passed this law, and I quote, "That Anabaptism, familialism, antinomianism, and generally all of like nature which oppose and undermine and slight the Scriptures may be duly and seasonably oppressed." They also condemned their ideas of religious freedoms, and they phrased it this way: "Any carnal liberty under a deceitful color of liberty of conscience." This was the response to true religious freedom. This was the history of your Baptist forefathers and mine. They weren't accepted. They weren't given a pat on the back and said, "Great job, great document." They weren't credited for their great views on religious freedom. They weren't honored or revered. None of those things. They faced strict and staunch persecution simply for their religious beliefs. And over here, just a couple hundred years later, we struggle with just being faithful to church. We struggle with reading our Bible every day. We struggle being consistent in prayer. We struggle with a thankful spirit. We struggle with complaining. While these people back just a couple hundred years ago were literally dying for their beliefs. Literally dying for their beliefs. All legal and under the law. This is the true history of the Baptist. This is what was happening. I'm afraid too often we get caught up in our own selves and in our own life and our own wants and wishes that we forget what so many people, so many men and women fought for us to have, even today, fought for our beliefs, fought for our Baptist heritage. Let's not let that heritage go to waste. September 9th, 1646, they passed that law. September 9th, 1646. I want to travel just 5 years earlier, though. A man landed in Boston in 1639 with his wife Elizabeth, his son Jonathan, and a little daughter on the way. It seemed peaceful in Boston, but in these streets they walked, people were literally hung for their disagreement with the state church. This Englishman, he moved to Salem, where he purchased a tract of land to start the first glass factory in the New World. Who was that man? Well, you'll have to come back next week to find out. Who's the man who bought a tract of land to start the first glass factory in the New World, and the man that would be the next stepping stone within our Baptist history series? Let me encourage you this. Out of all the lives we've discussed up to this point, this is the one, up to this point, this is the one that you will not want to miss. Out of all of them, this is the one you will not want to miss. Because his story, it's incredible. Don't miss it. Make sure to tune back in next week. But until that time, let me encourage you with a heart filled to do something for God. Let me stir you up through the remembrance of our Baptist history, as Peter said in 1 Peter. Let me stir you up to do something. So during this week, keep looking up and keep stirred up for the cause of Christ.